This is the story of a little girl whose childhood was so dark that if you heard the full details, you'd lose sleep for weeks. But this same girl would grow up to become the most powerful woman in the world. She brought kings to their knees, held politicians in her palm, and made an entire empire dance to her will. Today, I'm going to tell you how a small child turned her pain into a weapon and changed the course of history forever. Theodora's story begins with a death. Her father, Cassius, was known as the Bear Keeper. He trained massive brown bears for the bloody spectacles in Constantinople's Hippodrome. This wasn't just any job, it was an official position within the powerful Green faction. In the year 504, Constantinople wasn't simply divided by politics. It was split into two massive rival forces, the Blues and the Greens. These weren't just sports teams. They controlled everything: jobs, wealth, entertainment, even law enforcement. Your loyalty to one faction determined your entire future. For Cassius and his family, their place seemed secure until the day he died suddenly, without warning. By ancient custom, his widow and 3 daughters should have been protected. His position as Bear Keeper should have passed to them, ensuring their survival. But corruption had other plans. Asterius, the Green faction's dancing master who controlled entertainment jobs, had been offered a bribe. Instead of protecting Cassius's family, he handed the precious position to someone else entirely. That single act of greed condemned Theodora, her mother, and her 2 sisters to a system designed to devour children. Theodora's mother faced an impossible choice: watch her daughters starve in the streets or feed them to the Hippodrome's brutal machine. She chose survival. In a moment that would haunt Theodora forever, her mother dressed all 3 little girls as supplicants, placed wreaths of laurel around their innocent heads, and paraded them before 80,000 screaming spectators. It was an unspoken advertisement to the crowd. These children were now available, not for acting or singing, but for services the law itself defined as the lowest form of existence. The Greens, whose corruption had caused this tragedy, turned their backs in cold rejection. But the Blues, their political rivals, showed mercy. They offered Theodora's stepfather a position, and with that single act of kindness, her fate was sealed. She would never forget which faction had abandoned her family and which had shown compassion. This memory would fuel her quest for revenge for the rest of her life. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Your support helps us bring these incredible historical stories to life. And don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think about Theodora's journey so far. By the age of 10, Theodora was performing in spectacles so degrading they shocked even Roman audiences who were used to blood and violence. Her specialty became a twisted theatrical performance involving trained birds. The details are too disturbing to describe fully, but imagine a child forced to endure humiliation while thousands of grown men threw coins at her small body. To the roaring crowd, it was entertainment. To her, it was a daily lesson in survival. But the true horror didn't happen on the stage. It happened in the shadowy backrooms where children as young as 8 were forced to provide services to senators, merchants, and aristocrats. Byzantine law made no distinction. It labeled all actresses as available for any purpose, stripping away their humanity with legal precision. For most children caught in this system, such treatment broke their spirits completely. But Theodora was different. Instead of breaking, she began studying. Night after night, she observed how powerful men, senators, judges, wealthy merchants, lost all control and dignity when consumed by their desires. What destroyed children became her classroom. The Hippodrome became her university. Each humiliating performance taught her invaluable lessons about human weakness, desire, and manipulation. She learned that men who believed themselves invincible could be easily undone by their own obsessions. This was the twisted education that would forge the most dangerous woman in Byzantine history. For 6 long years, Theodora endured this nightmare. By 16, she was no longer just another performer. She had become the most requested entertainer in the Hippodrome, sought after not only for her beauty, but for her remarkable intelligence. The same senators who had once thrown coins at her now paid enormous sums for private audiences. They believed they were purchasing pleasure. In reality, they were feeding a predator who was carefully studying how to destroy them all. Then came an opportunity that would elevate her from exploited child to dangerous courtesan. Hysibulus, the Syrian governor of Libya, visited Constantinople on official business. He arrived with immense wealth and military authority. When he saw Theodora perform, he didn't want her for a single night. He wanted to possess her completely. He offered her the role of his personal concubine, which meant freedom from the Hippodrome and a life of unimaginable luxury. After 6 years of degradation, it seemed like salvation itself. She accepted without hesitation. For nearly 4 years, she lived in Hysibulus's magnificent palace in Libya. But this wasn't just luxury. It was graduate-level education in the art of manipulation. Hysibulus believed he owned her completely, but Theodora was dissecting every weakness, cataloging which desires shamed him most, which fantasies he couldn't resist, which indulgences clouded his judgment entirely. The powerful governor who commanded entire armies became helpless when she controlled his access to pleasure. The same dynamic she had witnessed countless times in the Hippodrome now became her personal weapon. But she grew overconfident and began influencing his political decisions. When he finally realized the extent of her manipulations, his rage was explosive and terrifying. "Get out, you worthless creature!" he screamed, hurling her belongings into the burning desert sand. After 4 years of power and comfort, she found herself abandoned, alone, humiliated, and exiled back into a world that saw her as nothing more than property. Yet this betrayal became her most important lesson of all. The journey back across the Mediterranean Sea hardened her into something new. Ship by ship, port by port, she sold herself to survive. But now, each man who thought he was using her became another case study in human weakness. A Roman merchant who paid for intelligent conversation, she drew out his most guarded trade secrets. A ship captain who offered her free passage, she uncovered his illegal smuggling operations. Every encounter built her growing database of how male desire could be weaponized and turned into devastating leverage. By the time she reached the great city of Alexandria, she had transformed into something truly terrifying. No longer a victim, but a predator of extraordinary capability. In Alexandria, she discovered religion, but not for spiritual salvation. She converted to Monophysite Christianity under Patriarch Timothy III. This wasn't genuine faith, it was pure strategy. For the first time in her life, she was building a power base completely outside the world of exploitation and abuse. Later in Antioch, she met Macedonia, a performer who worked for the blues faction. Macedonia carried fascinating rumors back to Constantinople, rumors that a mysterious prince named Justinian, who was 40 years old and heir to the Byzantine throne, had been making inquiries about a woman who had survived Libya. Stories had spread throughout the empire of a girl who had endured the Hippodrome, manipulated a powerful governor, and survived exile in the desert. When her ship finally approached Constantinople's Golden Harbor, Theodora gazed upon the magnificent domes of the city that had once discarded her like garbage. But she was no longer that terrified child. The years of suffering had reforged her, hardened her, and weaponized her in ways that would soon shake the foundations of the empire. The city that had once cheered at her humiliation was about to bow before her unprecedented power. Constantinople, 522 CE. Prince Justinian, the designated heir to the Byzantine throne, attended a routine court gathering when he first laid eyes on Theodora. To him, she appeared to be just another beautiful former performer seeking patronage. He had absolutely no idea he was staring at a woman who had spent 16 years mastering the deadly art of destroying powerful men through their own desires. The seduction began immediately, but this was no ordinary romantic attraction. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. Theodora drew upon everything she had learned in her years of survival. She knew exactly how to study a man's deepest desires, how to make his weaknesses into her weapons, how to turn intimacy into absolute control. She discovered Justinian's hunger for intelligent conversation, a technique she had perfected during her desperate journey across Mediterranean ships. She uncovered his profound longing for genuine emotional connection, the same vulnerability she had once exploited in Governor Hysabolus. Every private moment they shared was meticulously calculated. Every whispered word, every gentle touch was designed to bind him deeper into her web of influence. Within just a few months, Justinian was completely enthralled. He believed with all his heart that he was falling deeply in love. In reality, he was being systematically programmed by a master manipulator. For Theodora, each encounter was simply another lesson in how to control a man through his desires. For Justinian, each moment pulled him further into a dependence he didn't even recognize. When he announced his intention to marry her, scandal erupted throughout the entire empire like wildfire. Byzantine law was crystal clear on this matter. Once an actress, always an actress. No senator, and certainly not a future emperor, could legally marry a woman who had performed on stage. The law was specifically designed to keep entertainers permanently excluded from any real power. The Senate erupted in unprecedented outrage. "You would marry such a woman?" they sneered in disbelief. To them, Theodora was completely unworthy of the imperial throne. But Justinian found himself unable to let her go. His obsession had grown far too strong to overcome. The greatest obstacle proved to be Empress Euphemia, wife of Emperor Justin. She had risen from slavery to achieve the highest female position in the empire through her own cunning and determination. She immediately recognized exactly what Theodora represented: the weaponization of intimacy for political conquest and personal gain. "I climbed up from slavery," Euphemia declared boldly before the entire court, pointing an accusing finger directly at Theodora. "But I was never what she has been." The confrontation was absolutely electric. Two women who had clawed their way out of desperate circumstances now stood face to face in a battle that would determine the empire's future. Euphemia understood the danger perfectly. She fought to block the marriage at every possible turn, forbidding legal reforms, shutting Theodora out of court ceremonies, and standing as an immovable wall between her and the throne. The Empress used every ounce of her influence to prevent what she saw as a catastrophic mistake for the empire. Then, on one cold winter night in 523 CE, Empress Euphemia died suddenly in her sleep. No warning signs, no apparent illness, no witnesses to her final moments. The timing was so perfect it defied all reasonable coincidence. Theodora had once learned from other women in her darkest days which herbs could incapacitate or kill, which substances left no trace in the body. By pure chance or calculated murder, Euphemia was permanently removed from the equation. Within mere hours of her death, Emperor Justin drafted extraordinary new legislation. It specifically allowed former actresses to marry men of the highest social rank. The law was so precisely written, it might as well have been carved with Theodora's name upon it. The legal barrier that had stood for centuries crumbled overnight. 2 years later, in the magnificent Hagia Sophia, Theodora walked down the marble aisle wearing imperial purple robes. The same woman who had once been forced to lie naked on the Hippodrome floor now stood as Justinian's wife and future empress. Every step was pure theater. Every glance was a masterful performance. The child who had been sold for bronze coins had successfully transformed exploitation into a golden crown. Their marriage became unlike any partnership in recorded history. Theodora wasn't simply Justinian's wife. She became his advisor, his obsession, and eventually her co-ruler. But the true test of her ruthless transformation was yet to come, and it would reveal the full extent of what she had become. January 5th, 532 CE brought chaos that threatened to destroy everything. Constantinople erupted in the most dangerous rebellion the empire had ever faced. For the first time in living memory, the blues and greens, usually bitter enemies, united in revolt against imperial rule. Their battle cry echoed through burning streets, Nika, meaning conquer. But their fury wasn't directed at taxes or unpopular laws. Their fury was aimed specifically at one person, the Empress, who had risen from the lowest depths to supreme power.
Death to the prostitute, they chanted as fires consumed entire districts. The magnificent Hagia Sophia burned to the ground. The Senate House collapsed in roaring flames. Blood flowed like rivers through the ancient streets. Even trusted soldiers began defecting to the rebels. Justinian's own bodyguards started wavering in their loyalty. The mob crowned a new emperor, Hypatius, and the entire Byzantine Empire teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Inside the imperial palace, panic reigned supreme. Justinian's closest advisors fell to their knees, begging him to flee immediately. Treasury chests were already being loaded onto ships waiting in the harbor, ready for emergency evacuation. "Save yourself, Majesty," they pleaded desperately. "Abandon the city before it's too late. Escape while you still can." But to run meant abandoning Theodora. To flee meant letting go of the woman who had become the very foundation of his power and identity. Then Theodora rose from her throne. Her silk robes rustled like whispers of destiny as she stood before the terrified council. The air was thick with smoke and fear. Candles flickered uncertainly in the choking haze. When she spoke, her voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "My opinion," she declared with absolute calm, "is that this is no time for flight, even though it promises safety." Every eye in the room turned to her with a mixture of awe and terror. "May I never be separated from this purple robe. May I never live to see the day when those who meet me do not address me as their empress." She paused, letting her words sink into their souls. "I approve of an ancient saying, royalty makes an excellent burial shroud." Her words froze the entire room into stunned silence. She had endured beatings, humiliation, and degradation in the Hippodrome for years. This rebellion was nothing she hadn't faced before, only on a larger scale. The screaming mob outside was no different from the men who had once demanded her body for their entertainment. She understood crowds better than anyone alive, and now she used that hard-earned knowledge to bend Justinian's will to her own. The emperor made his choice. Instead of retreat, he chose massacre. Theodora's plan was as brilliant as it was brutal. Generals Belisarius and Mundus would trap the celebrating rebels inside the Hippodrome during their premature victory celebration. The same arena where Theodora had once performed degrading acts for coins would become their mass grave. As nearly 100,000 people packed the ancient stone stands, believing they had won their revolution, soldiers silently surrounded the building and slammed every gate shut with iron finality. What followed was slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Swords flashed in the afternoon sun, cutting through rebel bodies like wheat before the harvest. Spears pierced flesh with deadly precision. The screams of the dying ricocheted off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of blood sport. Entire families were cut down where they stood, their revolutionary dreams drowning in pools of their own blood. By the time the sun set that day, 30,000 corpses littered the arena floor like discarded dolls. Theodora had successfully turned the Hippodrome, the stage of her childhood humiliation, into the site of her ultimate and most terrible revenge. The massacre changed everything. After the rebellion was crushed, Justinian completely restructured his government according to Theodora's suggestions. In 535 CE, a revolutionary new decree required all provincial governors to swear loyalty not just to the emperor, but to Theodora as well. For the first time in the entire history of the Roman Empire, a woman stood officially recognized as co-ruler with equal authority. The child who had been forced into prostitution was now the undisputed master of the very men who had once purchased her services. From her private chambers, she created what historians would later call a parallel government. But it was far more sophisticated than that. It was an intelligence network that rivaled anything the world had ever seen. Trusted servants moved through palace corridors like shadows, gathering the most intimate secrets. Who was sleeping with whom? Which senators harbored shameful addictions? Which military officers were vulnerable to blackmail? Which merchants were hiding illegal activities? Theodora transformed palace gossip into devastating political weapons. Fear became her primary currency, and she spent it with the skill of a master financier. In public ceremonies, she demanded that every visitor prostrate themselves completely and kiss both her feet and Justinian's. This wasn't about religious reverence, it was about absolute domination. The humiliation she had once suffered was now being reversed with deadly precision and mathematical exactness. Her methods of dealing with enemies became legendary for their psychological sophistication. In 537 CE, when Pope Silverius refused to support her religious allies, Theodora didn't engage in theological debate. Instead, she simply destroyed him. Through General Belisarius and his wife Antonina, she fabricated elaborate treason charges. The Pope found himself accused of secretly conspiring with Gothic enemies and was sent into permanent exile, where he died alone and forgotten. But Theodora's most brilliant assassination was yet to come. Her target was John the Cappadocian, the Praetorian prefect and one of the empire's most genuinely powerful men. John was dangerous not because of his physical strength, but because he understood manipulation almost as well as she did. He was largely immune to her usual tactics and could see through most of her psychological games. So Theodora turned to a form of warfare that was purely psychological in nature. For 6 long months, John began receiving disturbing gifts delivered to his home by anonymous messengers, wilted flowers that symbolized approaching death, tiny ornamental daggers that hinted at violence, paintings depicting various forms of execution. Each delivery was carefully designed to unnerve him and cloud his judgment. Slowly but surely he began to mentally break down. He lost sleep, jumping at every shadow, sweating with paranoia even during routine meetings. Theodora was recreating the same psychological torment she had endured as a helpless child in the Hippodrome. But now, she was the one inflicting the suffering, and she found it deeply satisfying.
Finally, she sprang her carefully prepared trap. Working closely with Antonina, Belisarius's wife and her most trusted ally, Theodora arranged a fake conspiracy meeting that supposedly involved John's own daughter. Hidden surveillance agents recorded his every word during the staged encounter. When the evidence was presented to Justinian, John was immediately charged with high treason against the state. The man who had once held the empire's purse strings fell from the absolute heights of power to become a beggar wandering the streets of Egypt. Theodora's message to all potential enemies was unmistakably clear. She didn't simply destroy those who opposed her, she completely unmade them, erasing their power, wealth, and dignity, as if they had never existed. By this point in her reign, she had perfected the art of governing through systematic fear. Her private chambers functioned as a shadow court where secrets were traded like precious commodities. Every senator, every general, every bishop throughout the empire knew with absolute certainty that the empress maintained detailed files on their personal lives. Their desires, their affairs, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. She possessed the means to destroy absolutely anyone who crossed her path. But Theodora's most lasting and significant power wasn't found in political assassinations or palace intrigue. It was embedded in legislation that still influences our world today. Working in partnership with Justinian, she helped reshape Roman law in ways that continue echoing through Western legal tradition. Her personal fingerprints can be found throughout the Corpus Juris Civilis, which became the foundation of legal systems across Europe. Her reforms read like the systematic vengeance of someone who had survived humanity's darkest abuses. She outlawed forced prostitution entirely. She ordered brothels closed if they prevented women from leaving voluntarily. She made rape punishable by death, regardless of the perpetrator's social rank or wealth. She dramatically expanded divorce rights for women. She ensured that rapists' property was automatically transferred to their victims as compensation. Each law wasn't simply about justice, it was calculated retribution. She was literally coding her personal pain and trauma into the very fabric of imperial law, ensuring that future generations of women would have protections she had never enjoyed as a child. Yet her reforms also revealed the darker aspects of her character. She established the Metanoia convent, where former prostitutes were essentially forced into religious life, whether they wanted it or not. Even in liberation, she demanded complete control over other women's choices and bodies, just as hers had once been controlled by others. June 28, 548 CE, Theodora died at the relatively young age of 48, most likely from cancer. Her death completely shattered Justinian emotionally and psychologically. The emperor who had once commanded vast armies, restructured legal systems, and ruled the world's greatest city collapsed into inconsolable despair. He never remarried. He never recovered his former strength or decision-making ability. For 17 more years he remained on the throne, but the fire that had once driven his ambitions was completely extinguished. The woman who had controlled him so completely in life continued controlling him even in death. Perhaps the greatest evidence of her extraordinary influence can be seen in what happened to imperial policy after her passing. During Theodora's lifetime, Justinian had passed sweeping reforms, crushed major rebellions, and expanded the empire's power across 3 continents. After her death, virtually no significant legislation emerged from the imperial court. The brilliant creativity of his reign had never been his alone. It had been their partnership, their collaboration, their shared vision of power. In Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitale, a magnificent mosaic still displays her image in dazzling imperial robes, portrayed larger than all the other court figures. She wears purple fabric embroidered with images of the Magi bringing gifts to the infant Christ. It was her final masterpiece of political theater, the trafficked child, turned prostitute, turned empress, now immortalized as a holy figure, equal to biblical royalty. Today, tourists casually walk through the ruins of the ancient Hippodrome, where Theodora once endured unimaginable humiliation for bronze coins. They pose for cheerful photographs on the same stones where 30,000 rebels were systematically slaughtered at her direct command. They gaze admirably at museum mosaics depicting her as a divine figure, blessed by God himself. Few of these visitors truly understand the brutal reality behind the beautiful artwork. The girl who was once sold for entertainment became the most psychologically dangerous woman in Roman history. She proved beyond doubt that barbaric treatment doesn't only create broken victims, it can forge predators who use their trauma as a devastating weapon against the entire world. Her reign was built on the twisted psychology of systematic abuse. Her empire was governed by the hard-learned lessons of exploitation and survival. Her legacy serves as an eternal reminder that the line between victim and destroyer can be terrifyingly thin, and that sometimes the most damaged people become the most capable of inflicting damage upon others. Theodora's complete story stands as both inspiration and warning. Childhood suffering doesn't simply break people into helpless fragments. Sometimes, in rare and dangerous cases, it creates monsters who are fully capable of breaking entire empires and reshaping the course of human civilization through the sheer force of their will to survive and dominate.